Hello everyone, my name is Charles Godfrey. I'm Director of the Oxford Martin School and also of the Oxford Martin Programme on the Future of Food. And I want to welcome you to a very interesting talk this afternoon, which is going to be given by Doug Gollin on investing in agricultural research, lessons from the Green Revolution and the pandemic. Just a brief introduction to Doug. Doug is a Professor of Development Economics here in Oxford, and he's based in the Oxford Department of International Development. Doug started off his career in Harvard and Yale and did his PhD in economics from at the University of Minnesota, and has done many fascinating things, both in academia and also in advisory roles, for example, at the CGIAR, and most recently in UK government for our Department of International Development. Doug currently serves as a research director for a major global program on structural transformation and economic growth, which is funded by our UK Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. So with no further ado, Doug, can I go over to you to give your talk? Oh, and before I do that, can I just remind everyone that we are very keen to get some questions for Doug at the end. You'll see to the bottom right of your screen that there's a facility to ask questions, and you can also vote on questions. So keep an eye on the questions, and if you see a question that someone else has put up that you're very keen for Doug to address, then please do vote for that question. It makes my job much easier because I'll be picking the questions to put to Doug. So Doug, over to you.
So thank you very much, Charles. I'm going to go ahead and share a few slides here. And let's see if are these visible?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to talk today about investments in agricultural research. And I'm going to define this term fairly broadly to include both bioscience and social science. And I should begin, I guess, with the disclaimer, which might not be very apparent from my title. I'm a development economist, and my talk is very much going to focus on the developing world. The developing world, of course, doesn't exist in a separate planet from the developed world. We're connected by all kinds of linkages, movements of people and goods and ideas and information. But I'm going to focus on the developing world partly because it's where my own work falls, and partly because the majority of the world's farmers live in developing countries, and the poorest countries in the world are also the most dependent on agriculture. In very broad terms, I'm going to argue that investments in agricultural research have the potential to deliver really substantial benefits to human welfare in many of the world's poorest countries. But I'm also going to argue that we need to think hard and to think deeply about how to plan and prioritize these investments. So I'm going to just give you a brief overview of what the lecture is going to do. I'm going to argue first that for these countries, public sector research, typically funded as part of the global commitment to development assistance, is vital in shaping the technologies that are available and in increasing the productivity of agriculture. I'm also going to appeal to some relatively new evidence. I'm going to talk about a paper of my own that shows that historical investments in agricultural research have created remarkably large benefits in terms of income and human health outcomes. And so I'm really going to talk about the Green Revolution experience, call it the first 40 years or so of the Green Revolution from 1960 to 2000. Then I'm going to try to acknowledge, I won't spend much time in trying to quantify what are the undoubted social costs of the Green Revolution. I'm going to be referring primarily to environmental impacts, but there are also other claims about negative social and cultural and political impacts. And I want to acknowledge those because I think there's some really important lessons for research planning and investment prioritization about the negatives that are perhaps unintended consequences of research. And then I'm going to move towards some conclusions. I'm going to move towards the conclusion. The first main point will be the need for continued and perhaps expanded research investments. But I'm also going to talk about the need to direct and to plan and to monitor the impacts of research investment, including monitoring, if you can imagine such a thing, monitoring the unintended impacts of research. And then I'm going to try finally, because it's the pandemic year and it's a pandemic moment, to try to link this to a more general observation that I think flows out of the pandemic experience, which is about the value of forward-looking investments in research, informed by the probabilities of scientific success, but also informed by the vulnerabilities of global systems to different problem scenarios. And I'm going to make the case, I think, that we've done too little of that in the agricultural world. So with all of that as a preliminary, let me move on to the main focus of my argument. As I said a minute ago, I'm going to primarily focus here on developing countries. In addition to that being my area of interest, I think it's also relevant that agricultural research in the context of developing countries, to a significant extent, at least in the poorest developing countries, is an area that's dominated by public sector investments. Private sector research is, of course, hugely important in the developing world as in the richer countries. But for a number of reasons that I won't go into, public sector research plays a particularly essential role in the world's poorest countries. And public sector agricultural research investments are those that are heavily shaped by development organizations. And so because of that, this is an area where it's one of a small number of areas, perhaps, where there's both the potential and I think an obligation for the development community to influence the level and the direction of research, the focus of research itself. I'm going to be talking in particular about the CGIAR. The CGIAR is an agricultural research consortium of primarily publicly funded institutions. As I put here on the slide, they define themselves these days as a global research partnership for a food secure future. The broader context is that you can think concretely of a set of international centers, many of which, the oldest of which date back to around 1960. And it's one of the main vehicles. The CGIAR plays a significant role in channeling funding into agricultural research for developing countries. We're talking of a total CGIAR budget that, well, it peaked around 2014 at about $1 billion a year. It's fallen off somewhat since then, and there's certainly an effort in place to pursue higher funding levels through a new strategy. $1 billion a year sounds like a lot. It is a lot, in fact, but to keep it in some perspective, you say that this is a small amount relative to agricultural value added in the least developed countries. It's less than 0.5%, I think, of the agricultural GDP, if you like. And it's also small in relation to total global agricultural research spending. It's only about 2% of the total funding for research in developing countries. If you include the larger set of, you include China and Brazil and India, the CGIAR looks very small. Here's a figure from work by Julian Alston and Phil Pardee, a couple of agricultural economists who've worked quite extensively on documenting funding. You can see the CGIAR spending as a share of total R&D for developing countries is staying fairly stable here, around 2% of the total research spending for the developing world. It's actually increased over time as a share of public research as individual governments have stepped back, but it's decreased as a share in relative terms to the private research expenditure. What is true is that for the poorest of developing countries, the CGIAR remains a really important player in generating new technologies. And so what we need to know is something about the impact of past investments and perhaps of agricultural research more generally. How do we think about targeting or prioritizing research investments? Those are the questions I want to turn to next. I want to start by talking a little bit about the challenges of assessing the long-term and large-scale impacts of agricultural research. The difficulty, among other things, is that these agricultural research investments have extraordinarily long time lags before they really generate impact. And they also have very geographically diffuse benefits. A lot of the impacts don't take place within the agriculture sector. They spill across into the rest of the economy. And particularly in poor countries, you can think of a new agricultural technology or something that's widely taken up as having big impacts on economic behavior across the entire economy. If poor farmers have more money in their pockets, they may be able to buy more goods produced in other sectors. We might see complex changes in the structure of agriculture. Maybe new technologies promote consolidation of small farms and drive people into urban areas. Or alternatively, we could think of all kinds of scenarios in which new technologies have impacts that aren't observed specifically on the farms where the technologies are adopted. So this makes evaluating the impact quite complicated. The economics literature has done a couple of things. We've got a set of studies over many years, including some work I've been involved in, that uses model-based approaches. And there's also efforts just to use statistical approaches and empirical efforts to try to uncover the impact of technologies. I'm going to talk next about a recent piece of work I've done with a couple of colleagues, Casper Worm Hansen and Asger Vingender, both from the University of Copenhagen. This is a paper that's forthcoming in the Journal of Political Economy. And we tried to estimate the impacts, the aggregate economic impacts of the Green Revolution. And I want to tell you a little bit about the paper itself. The title, by the way, of Two Blades of Grass comes from a quote from Gulliver's Travels, if any of you recommend this. Swift wrote in that paper, he said, "Whoever makes 2 ears of corn or 2 blades of grass to grow upon a spot of ground where only one grew before would deserve better of mankind and do more essential service to his country than the whole race of politicians put together." So I think that's a useful jumping off point for talking about impacts of science today. In this paper, what we've done is we've used an empirical strategy that relies on the fact that so much of the research driving the Green Revolution came out of the international centers of what's now the CGIAR. These centers really played a key role in providing the genetic material that formed the basis for high-yielding varieties of food crops. And so for a large set of crops, we can actually assign precise dates to the origins of Green Revolution varieties in those crops. Just to give you an example, the first two of the CGIAR centers, many of you will know these, were the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, which was founded, depending on how you define things, in 1960, and where the first breeding efforts began at the end of 1962. And then there's the International Center for Maize and Wheat Improvement in Mexico, CIMMYT, which followed a pre-existing Rockefeller Foundation program that dated back to the late 1940s and was gradually incorporated also in the early 1960s. Subsequently, other centers were established with mandates to work on different crops in different regions, and increasingly over time for non-crop functions, social science, water management, forest management, and so on. I'm going to focus here on the crops and the crop centers. And the point I want to make is that from the perspective of individual developing countries, the initial timing of the research going on those crops was largely exogenous. And just to give you a sense of what I have in mind, here's a picture of from the International Rice Research Institute. So I said they began breeding efforts in 1962. In the first months of breeding, actually the first 38 crosses that were made in the end of that year, most of them used dwarf materials. And the 8th cross was one labeled IR8, which matched the Indonesian variety Peta, which you can see here, with a semi-dwarf variety Dijiawujen. This was a semi-dwarf variety, responded extraordinarily well to fertilizer compared to existing varieties. And this cross, known as IR8, was selected through a number of generations, and the 5th generation hybrids were in 1966 released to national programs. Within a few years, that variety was taken up and grown across millions of hectares of rice area around the world. Interestingly, and I'll come back to this actually, at least one of the other crosses from those first 38, so really in the first month of crossing, was also a major variety. IR5 became highly important in some parts of Southeast Asia. I think it's telling, and it's something I'll come back to because it's very revealing of the fact that the scientists had targets. They knew exactly what they were looking for. The targets were extraordinarily well defined. They were looking for a particular plant architecture of dwarf varieties or semi-dwarf varieties which would respond to fertilizer in particular ways. In any event, what we've done in our paper is we've looked across 16 crops that were targets of breeding in different CGIAR centers, and we can pin down fairly precisely in the same way the first instance in which a new variety, a high-yielding variety, was developed in each of these centers. And that gives us a point in time where we can think about how these new high-yielding varieties arrive on the international scene and begin to become available to developing countries. So that allows us to think about the differences in the take-up of high-yielding varieties and the impact that they're going to have on different countries. This slide points out that there's time variation. Some crops become available, have high-yielding varieties that become available in 1960, others not until much later. And so that allows us to get both temporal variation and variation across countries based on the types of crops that they were producing prior to the Green Revolution. And that allows us to give a kind of before and after growth trajectory for each crop, and then looking at the different crop mixes in different countries, that gives us a way to think about what might have happened to agricultural productivity in these countries as a result of the crops that they grew in 1960 and on the research output of the international system. So we use that prediction of what crop yield, how crop yield in each country was influenced by the international system. That's a kind of prediction. And it has the virtue that we can then kind of think of those changes in agricultural productivity as quasi-exogenous and almost quasi-experimental treatment, if you like, for the countries that were the beneficiaries of the international research. It is important for us that not all countries get the same treatment. So when we look at different countries, because countries differed in their crop mix prior to the Green Revolution, they experienced different timing and intensity of the Green Revolution science. And so countries that were initially dependent on important Green Revolution crops, such as wheat and rice, benefited earlier and more strongly in terms of their improved agricultural productivity. So you can see this perhaps, maybe imperfectly, in the figure here. The top panel of this shows different crops that were of the most important food crops prior to the Green Revolution. You can see the rice-growing countries perhaps in light gray, and groundnut or bean-producing countries in the darker black. And then depending on the crops that were being cultivated, different countries receive different treatment or treatment intensity, if you like, from the Green Revolution over time. And that is very much the empirical approach of our paper. Happy to talk more about it, but I want to move ahead a little bit and just to give a couple of key findings. Thinking still about the impact of these research investments, what we find are very large impacts. We find increases in yields of food crops of about 45% between 1965 and 2010. Countries differ quite a lot depending on exactly which mix of crops they were growing. And then we go on to link those increases in agriculture and agricultural productivity to broader measures of economic development. So we find what are probably the most striking result is we find large increases in per capita income, per capita GDP. We find, for instance, that just a delay of about 10 years in the onset of the Green Revolution would have had a discernible impact 50 years later. In 2010, per capita income across our set of countries would have been about 15% lower had the Green Revolution started a decade later. So we find big impacts on GDP per capita. We find impacts as well on the population did not just grow faster and kind of erase those benefits. We found that life expectancy at birth improves. We find improvements in schooling that seem to correlate with the changes in agricultural productivity. And I guess we also find, though it's not easy to pin down, we find some evidence that the increases in yield that come through the HYV, the high-yielding varieties, probably reduce the amount of land in agriculture in many of our countries, though I think this is it's a trickier result. I would just say ours is not the only paper to look at this using similar strategies. There's two other excellent studies that I flag here, both recently published in the Journal of Health Economics. Both look at health outcomes and actually specifically infant mortality across, in response to Green Revolution technologies. You could think of infant mortality as a particularly powerful net measure of impacts for the poor, since poor people are particularly vulnerable to nutrition and other problems that are related to infant mortality. One of these papers looks globally at grid cells across countries based on their suitability for different crops. The other does something similar for locations within India. Both of them use empirical strategies similar to the one I've outlined above. In other words, some locations are more suitable for certain crops, and those locations that they were well suited to crops that got big productivity boosts in the Green Revolution observed greater impacts in terms of reductions in infant mortality. There's obviously a lot of potential for confounding factors to creep into all of these papers. And in the interest of time, I won't go into this except to say I think these are careful papers. These papers, not our own, of course, but the other two papers are written by research teams that have been very attentive to their use of statistical methods. So I guess I want to move on to make a claim here that these benefits are large, and I think they're compelling. I think the evidence is pretty good, but I think it's also selective in the sense that, not deliberately selective, but in the sense that the outcomes that we've considered in our papers, which are basically income and health outcomes, are useful measures, but they leave aside a lot of other costs of the Green Revolution, some of which we know were quite profound. And the costs typically didn't accrue to the same people who realized the gains, so that means there's heterogeneity of impact as well. Heterogeneity in geography, in social class, and in intertemporal impacts. So one of the key dimensions that our papers say nothing about is on environmental impacts. And here, I think I won't attempt to summarize a very large literature that's emerged over several decades that's looked into these topics, but I would just say I think it's important to acknowledge that the Green Revolution caused harm in addition to creating benefits. Substantial harms from chemical inputs and other dimensions of intensification, including impacts on soil and water. As I say, I'm less sure about the aggregate land use impacts and the impacts on agricultural biodiversity because there were some competing effects. But I think these are questions that are worth asking. I'm also aware of a big literature that I take very seriously that has focused on the social harms. I think this is a trickier area, partly because of the complexity of social changes. It's much harder to attribute to a single technological innovation a whole range of social changes. It's difficult to read social change through an unambiguous normative lens. But there's a lot of concern over income distribution, concentration of land holdings, changes in social structures. And I think these are important issues. To their credit, the scientists, and actually the social scientists involved in the early years of the Green Revolution, were very well attuned to this kind of impact. And so a number of our oldest and longest running studies in development economics actually date back to this period. There was an effort to track social and economic changes in communities experiencing the Green Revolution. So there was social scientists at the time were thinking hard about distributional impacts and other dimensions of agrarian change. So things like the now famous ICRISAT village studies and long-running household surveys in the Philippines and Indonesia and elsewhere date to this period. There was a real concern. The new seeds might favor large-scale farmers or lead to mechanization that would displace the poorest who are agricultural laborers. So there was data collected. I would say that the data, the contemporaneous studies were I'd say, relatively, claim to find relatively little negative distributional impact of the Green Revolution. But this is obviously a topic that's been highly contested elsewhere. And I think it's something where there's a large and active literature, and I'm not going to try to pass judgment on it today. I want to make the case, though, that there's something really interesting about the fact that we have evidence on many dimensions of the social and economic impacts. We have almost no evidence on the early environmental impacts. So this question of what we monitor and what we keep track of in relation to new technologies is something that I think is of key importance, and I want to come back to that. So what lessons do we take from the Green Revolution experience? It's really tempting to stop here and declare success of the Green Revolution. I could move straight into giving you a kind of rousing plea for more investments in agricultural research and let's have another Green Revolution. There's a lot of that rhetoric out there. It wouldn't be a bad message, to be clear, and I might yet get there, but I actually want to reflect a little more deeply on the lessons I think we can take away from the Green Revolution. In particular, I think it's an oversimplification to suggest that we ought to attempt to repeat the same experience, using new scientific understanding to increase the yields of staple food crops. I think we could make a case for doing that, but I think the hope that it would generate the same kind of large economic impacts is probably not a really well-founded hope. And so here my argument is really that the world is not the same place in 2021 as it was in 1965. And so our targets for research shouldn't be the same. I'm also going to make the case that what we should take away from the earlier experience is that well-defined targets for science have real power, but identifying the correct targets in complex systems is not simple. I'm going to make an argument as well that I think the language of bringing new green revolutions is a fundamentally optimistic rhetoric. And I think it's going to be important as we think about planning agricultural research investments to make sure that the worriers have a place at the table as well as the optimists. I think we haven't necessarily been good at doing that in the past. Monitoring matters. So as I just said, the fact that we knew to track, or that the community knew to track distributional consequences in the 1960s, but didn't think about tracking environmental impacts, is really revealing of something we need to think very hard about as we begin to design and to roll out new technologies in the 2020s. And then finally, I think I want to make the argument that research is a limited tool, and we shouldn't neglect other tools for development, other tools for improving human welfare. So I guess my next point is just to come back to each of these in turn. I think the fallacy of the idea that we can replicate Green Revolution strategies is in fact a fallacy. You know, I think the idea that we can have just a new Green Revolution or a doubly Green Revolution is ignoring the ways in which the world has changed since 1965. And I think at that point, increasing the output per unit of land for major staple food crops was arguably an entirely sensible strategy. But today, I think the world is quite different. For instance, I think we see a world in which for lots of farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, increasing income isn't necessarily going to come from growing more maize or more cassava. It's going to come from cash crops or off-farm activities, or maybe from some kind of individual or family migration to urban areas. Urban demand for food has also changed relative to Asia in the 1960s. Urban diets are more diversified. Urban diets are more globalized. People are eating more processed and prepared foods, more imported foods, not just starch staples. And so they're not just living off the surplus from their own rural hinterlands. In that context, increasing the yield of starch staples in rural Africa may not have the same economic driving force that the same strategy had in Asia in the 1960s. So we may need to think about different targets. We may need to choose targets that better reflect the realities of the complicated economic systems as well as the agricultural systems of today's developing countries. So that brings me really to my next point, which is about what targets we set. Science is pretty good at hitting clearly identified targets, but how do we set these targets in complex systems? Simplification of targets is important. Telling scientists that they should be aiming for increased yield potential is something well enough defined that a plant breeder can aim for that and perhaps hit it. But it's also the case that oversimplification can be misleading. So the example I put up on the slide here is that we tend to confuse crop yields with productivity increases, and we confuse both of those with profitability. Those are not the same thing. And so setting our targets at the things we care about is key. I think simplification is also a bit of a risk when it comes to understanding both the biological systems and the economic systems that we deal with. My understanding from Nick Harbord here at Oxford, for instance, is that the semi-dwarf traits of the Green Revolution rice and wheat varieties were linked through plant metabolism pathways that I don't pretend to understand to other traits in ways that breeders didn't fully appreciate. And so there is a lot of effort put into trying to achieve gains in other dimensions in these varieties, which were actually complicated because of the nature of the plant metabolism pathways themselves. So in a sense, a simplification on the biological system side created problems for breeders. And similarly, oversimplifying the economic systems creates problems as well. If we want to understand how a particular change in the technology is going to impact the agricultural system, we need to have a reasonably nuanced understanding of those systems. And here, the point I want to make is that we talk often very loosely about a global agricultural system or a global food system. I think we need to spend more time understanding that what we're really looking at is a set of very loosely articulated, maybe disarticulated systems that intersect in certain places, and understanding the nature of that articulation is important. My next point is about bad outcomes and really stress tests. And this is something where I think the pandemic has forced us to think much harder about the vulnerabilities of our systems. We focus generally on, the language of the agricultural community has been on pursuing research to promote healthy and sustainable diets for a more prosperous future world. That's kind of a rosy scenario. I'm wondering whether we have enough worried people in the room. Are we doing enough to stress test our food systems? Are we thinking hard enough about the vulnerabilities of different elements of the food system? Are we engaged enough in planning for crises and thinking through not just the specific problems such as wheat rusts or rice pests or coincident weather shocks, but actually thinking through the political responses to these problems, which, as we see in the case of the global fight over vaccine allocation, you could imagine something very similar arising in the context of a world food price crisis. We saw a bit of this in 2008, 2009. Are we really thinking through the political as well as the biological potential for crises? I should hurry up in the interest of time. I'm running a bit over. Mention here briefly that I think, again, monitoring matters. I raised this point earlier. As we invest in research, what do we monitor when we're looking for the impacts of the science? The scientists and social scientists of the original Green Revolution were aware that they should be monitoring labor markets. They weren't thinking about environmental impacts. In the same way, what are the impacts that we should be thinking about today, looking to the future? What are we blind to today? What are the things that we're not thinking about? What's the data that our successors will wish that we had collected 10 years or 20 years from now as they start to look back? How do we strategically think about the data collection and the monitoring of technological impacts so that we can both fine-tune the research as we go along and also evaluate it effectively ex post? How do we, on that subject as well, how do we resist the temptation to measure the outcomes that we suspect will be positive and to ignore the ones where we might be a little concerned that there will be negative outcomes? I think there's a political economy issue here that institutions and donor institutions in the development sphere often have limited incentives to study negative dimensions of their investments. So how do we make sure that we're monitoring impacts, both positive and negative, in a way that allows for science to be more responsive? Finally, I mean, how do we think of the limits of research as a tool? We tend to think of agricultural science as the tool that solves lots of problems, but for some problems, it's not a particularly useful or appropriate tool. You know, if we're thinking about improving nutrition outcomes, is agricultural science a better tool, or should we be investing in WASH interventions or school feeding programs or cash transfers? When and where is the science the right tool for us to use? And I think that goes along with a set of questions, not just about whether research is the right tool, but about the sequencing of research. What's the research that needs to take place now? What research would be well delayed for 5 or 10 years to let the basic science progress? And then how do we deal with portfolio questions? How do we think about research investments across an entire portfolio of activities? I think we don't yet have really good tools for understanding that. So it brings me to some concluding thoughts. And I think, again, it's in 2021, it's an obvious temptation to link everything to the pandemic. For those of us who are outside the biomedical community, I think there are nevertheless some lessons from COVID-19 for research planning. And I have a couple of thoughts here. I think, you know, we read a lot in the popular press, and I think it's entirely appropriate. There's lots of praise directed towards the scientists who developed vaccines. And of course, they deserve all of that praise and more. And there's lots of praise for the clinicians, the nurses and doctors and staff at all levels who've been involved in delivering vaccines. I don't want to detract in any way from the praise that's well-deserved there. But I want to suggest that there's also, I haven't heard much praise being directed at some less appreciated members of the science community. And I'm thinking of the people involved in research funding and research planning, whose decisions over 15, 20, 25 years, probably longer, contributed to the global capacity and the capability to address the problems. I'm thinking of the scientists, probably a bunch of them here at Oxford, who were sitting on funding panels that were attuned to the idea that coronavirus research was a valuable area for investment. And the funders who supported work on the development of mRNA vaccine platforms, for instance, in anticipation that these might prove valuable. I don't think that science planning and science prioritization itself gets much appreciation and is taken seriously enough as an area for study itself. Doing it right, clearly, and this year it's more obvious than ever, has big implications for human well-being. In the private sector, the direction of science is shaped by profit incentives. They have pretty clear market forces driving where research goes. And for public sector research, though, or public sector funding, that set of forces isn't there. And so I don't think we talk much, and I don't think we talk rigorously enough about science prioritization and planning. Where the conversations take place, they tend not to be very public. They often happen, I think, within narrow groups of specialists. There's very little work in my own field in economics about science priority setting, but it's an important area. And if we can get it right collectively, it matters. So what else can I say? Science delivers. In particular, I think international collaborative science matters, but we need to take this seriously. We need to think hard about how we balance successes with failures. And I think in agriculture, we need to be much more attuned to thinking about the vulnerabilities of different components of our system. And with that, I think I'll stop. So let me stop there and open things up for questions, with apologies for going a bit over here, Charles.
Thank you very much, Doug. That was absolutely fascinating. Can I remind people that please do both pose questions and also vote the questions that we have. I'm going to take chair's prerogative and ask the first question, Doug. And I want to go back to your fascinating analysis of the Green Revolution. Were you able, in your analysis, to use a sort of experiment, also ask questions about why in some areas the Green Revolution was less successful than others? And you see that across countries, and characteristically it is said that the Green Revolution was less successful in Africa than compared with Asia. And with your economist background, are there aspects of the human and social capital and the economic, the financial capital that might help explain these differences?
Talk about starting with a hard question. In our study, actually, we do pick up these differential effects across countries. The simple and short story that you get for the differential experience in sub-Saharan Africa is linked to the timing of, is really linked to geography in some ways. It's linked to the mix of crops that were being cultivated. Most sub-Saharan countries were in early years producing crops that got weaker Green Revolution impacts and later Green Revolution impacts. In other words, countries that were producing cassava and other root crops, there was very little research impact until at the earliest, probably the 1980s. And even then, the impacts were fairly modest compared to the impacts in wheat and rice. Maize doesn't deliver the same impacts as either wheat or rice, and maize in sub-Saharan Africa comes later. And so I think broadly, there's a story that's largely a geographic and an agroecological story that's told. Whether that's then compounded, and I think it almost certainly is, by differences in the research capacity of different countries, differences in the resources available to farmers, and then I think, again, in a more recent period, real differences in the linkages between rural and urban areas across the continent. In the 60s, so I think the timing, this shift in the world that I've kind of tried to describe, I think has had big and negative implications for the effectiveness of agricultural research, of the Green Revolution, if you like, in sub-Saharan Africa. By the time the research arguably starts to kick in the early 2000s or the late 1990s, the cities, which were in Asia the market for the surplus produced by farmers in rural areas, the cities in sub-Saharan Africa are already outward facing. They tend to be coastal. The importance of imported staples, the preference for rice and wheat, which are not necessarily produced domestically, meant that there was far less connection between rural areas and urban areas than was true for the Asian countries in the 60s. And I think that spatial disarticulation, between rural and urban areas has meant that there's a lack of effective demand for staple foods in many places, in at least from the perspective of a farmer in a remote rural area in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a real lack of effective demand for starch staples. So I think there's a whole set of stories here that I could go off on for a long time, but that'd be my short answer.
Thanks, Doug. That's fascinating. I'm going to go to some questions that have come in. The first one is from Avril Aslett Bentley. Would you agree that to avoid existing... Oh, sorry, this has just jumped, so I have to... Would you agree that to avoid existing problems, a whole systems approach is needed, complex as that may be? Also, may the Green Revolution benefits have driven greater industrial development with additional adverse environmental consequences? And perhaps I'll just add to that, it's interesting what the counterfactual might be to the Green Revolution. And if one hasn't had these high yielding crops, might there have been more environmental damage because one would have had to convert greater amounts of land into agriculture?
Yeah, so lots of pieces of that. In terms of the systems approach, I completely agree that I think bringing a systems approach both to the biology and the economics is important. But as I say, I think it's also recognizing that the systems here are very weakly, that there are multiple systems that are weakly articulated. So I'm thinking now as an economist of these spatial disarticulations, that we talk about a global food system, but in fact, if you're talking about pastoralists in the Barada Plateau in East Africa, I'm not convinced that they're very well articulated into a global food system. Thinking about the vulnerabilities of their food and agricultural system requires thinking not about the global system, but about local systems. And so I think the different global and local systems need to be, we need to recognize where they intersect and where they're separate. I think the question of how on the economic side, the agricultural transformations that we saw fed into industrialization, I think is also an interesting question. I think it's partly a question of what non-agricultural activities people moved into. And then, of course, again, a question of how conscious and what awareness there was of the environmental impacts of the industrialization processes that were unfolding. So I don't think you'd want to argue that it would have been better had there been no movement of people out of agriculture. I think the movement of people into non-agricultural activities has been a really important dimension of improvements in living standards. The movement of people to cities often allows for various kinds of greener, lower impacts on the environment. But I think, to Charles's last point, I think we need to be really careful not to bundle environmental impacts together. I think there's a lot of, we're lumping together a lot of things. And when you think about the climate impacts versus the land use impacts and biodiversity impacts, or the impacts on soil quality and water quality. These are related, and I don't think it's easy to generalize about any one change being entirely positive or entirely negative. Intensification, we find in the paper, reduced pressure on the extensive margin in terms of land use, but it increased then the pressure on, say, groundwater resources. And so I think those things, the question of how you trade off different environmental harms, I think is one that never received very much attention. That in a systems approach, you really ought to be thinking about how you trade off different environmental harms, different sectoral patterns of where people live and how they make their living. So huge complexity here.
Thanks, Doug. I'm going to go to a question from John Letts. Given that plant breeding and crop research around the world is dominated by Western and corporate interests, how do we redirect funding into alternative plant breeding approaches that increase yields and the reliability of yields in the period of climate change and preserve crop genetic diversity in local crops, all without the agrochemicals that Green Revolution crops depend on? So quite a bit packaged in that question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, of course. And there's an economist answer, which is to say that plant breeding may not be the only tool that we have. And so I guess I'd appeal here to my argument that we need to think about what we're asking research to deliver as opposed to other policy interventions. So it may be that if what we want to do is to reduce the use of chemical inputs, maybe we should tax them, or maybe we should think about policies that regulate the use of chemicals. On the plant breeding side, I think what you're seeing is a very, the private sector effort is really concentrated still in a fairly small number of crops. Maize and soybeans attract the bulk of research investments in the private sector. And I think there's no inherent reason why the private sector wouldn't, given the right incentives, be able to achieve the kind of technological targets that you're describing. In practice, I think the impetus here is not going to come from, the private sector research will deliver precisely the traits that have market value. And so maybe the place we need to start is on thinking about consumption, thinking about what diets are consumed, thinking about how we move food around the world. And so I think, and then how we price and tax inputs of different kinds. If we treat soil and water and air resources as common goods with no effort to rein in what happens to them, there's a fairly predictable outcome. So I think here I would argue that maybe it's less an issue of what public sector and private sector breeders do than of what the policies we have in place are that shape the incentives for breeders and shape the incentives for the research system.
But let me push back just briefly on that economist answer. So I can see that working in high-income countries, middle-income countries, but the sort of standards, incentives, and things that economists can talk about, can they really work in a country which essentially doesn't have a tax base and where the institutional and financial firepower of the government is very, very little?
Sure. So, I mean, I think if we're talking about the poorest countries in the world, the issue is not that the private sector is driving much research in any direction at all. In the poorest countries, we're still largely seeing research coming from the public sector institutions, which themselves can shape the direction of the research. So I think here we're talking about the really big middle-income agricultural producers, the Brazils and Chinas, perhaps India. And here I think the research systems, the public sector research systems continue to provide a lot of the germplasm, a lot of the genetic materials that flow into the private sector. I think there is a potential here to use the public sector research investments to shape or to provide an alternative to what the private sector is delivering. So maybe it's an issue of providing some competition from public research that provides a different set of technologies that can compete with what the private sector is putting out there. I do still think that there's ultimately, I'm not persuaded that there's I'm not persuaded that we can do this without policy interventions. I think policy is going to need to move along with the science to shape the direction of the research.
Thanks, Doug. Let me get to a question from David. That's all I have. And this relates to what you were talking about, picking targets. What are your thoughts on using nutrient density as a better metric for yield from as a better metric than yield from agriculture? What are the barriers to implementing such a system? And people might also want to, Barbara Harris-White has written a very interesting comment on that question as well.
So the trick here is that so I don't know who's measuring. So if you're talking about how the research system itself evaluates different research outputs, so different varieties, for instance, I think it might make great sense to think about nutrient density or any of a number of other measures we have. The use of yield as a simple partial productivity measure, output per unit of land, is almost certainly not the measure that we want. It neither corresponds to profitability from the farmer's perspective, which I would argue might be something you care about, nor is yield something that consumers ultimately care about. I think the idea of there's tracking or treating nutrient density as one of a number of characteristics of a variety is obviously something that you could do on research stations and in the research process. It's one of potentially many things you could. So you could look at nitrogen use efficiency, for instance, output per unit of nitrogen, or output per unit of water. So these partial productivity measures all have a place. I'll put on my economist hat again for a second and say that from the perspective of the farmer who's ultimately going to take up these varieties, the key, not the only determinant, but often the key determinant is profitability. And profitability is based on what they can sell and the price that they can command for the varieties that they're growing. If that's not in some way reflecting the nutrient density, then there's not much of an incentive for a farmer. Farmers may actually care about the quantity that they produce. And so this takes us into a whole complicated area about how different traits may or may not be observable from the perspective of consumers and may or may not be valued by consumers. So if nutrient density is valued by the consumers, but they're still unable to detect it when they look at a product in the market. If I go to the market, the wet market, and look at two different batches of maize, and I can't tell you which one has a higher protein concentration than the other, I'm not going to be willing to pay more for it just on the assertion of the seller that it's protein dense or nutrient dense. And so I think the observability of traits is an information problem that where there's again a number of things that we could consider doing, but the question of, is it valued by the consumer, is it observed and observable to the consumer, and therefore does it translate into something that would make a farmer more likely to adopt these varieties? That chain of thinking is one that I think we need to be, if you're not just in the science, in doing the science and trying to assess the characteristics of different crops, if you're actually trying to take these and persuade farmers to adopt nutrient-dense varieties, you're going to need to think hard about how that translates into marketability and market value. Here's potentially just one last comment on this. It may be a case where the private sector, not so much in the research side, but in the distribution side, has a role to play. Packaging, branding, providing some kind of quality guarantee is one of the things that the private sector knows how to do. And so you could imagine, in principle, you could imagine some kind of market segmentation arising in which, if consumers were persuaded that they were buying high quality goods of any kind, and that it was in fact traceable in some way, and that what they were paying for was in fact legitimate, you could imagine these markets emerging, as they have with, to some extent, even in a number of low-income countries. We're seeing a demand for organics emerging. We're seeing demand for humanely raised livestock and animal products emerging. There is a willingness to pay if people have some faith that they're getting what they're paying for.
Doug, I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you there. I have to say that over the years since we've both been in Oxford, I've had many conversations with you and been to talks, and I always come away understanding and learning a huge amount from listening to you, and this afternoon has been no exception. So on behalf of everyone who's tuned in, and thank you for tuning in and thank you for the questions, please join me in thanking Doug very much for a really fascinating presentation. Thank you, Doug.
Thanks so much, Charles, and thanks to everyone.